Settle in now, wherever you are. Loosen your shoulders. Let the day fall away from you like a coat slipping from a chair. And come with me back through the years. Back through the long, slow decades. Back through the hum of freeways and the glow of screens. Back to a quieter California, where the valley still smelled of fruit. It is the evening of the 24th of February, 1955. The sun has just gone down over the Santa Clara Valley, and the air is warm in the way only a California February can be. Gentle, almost forgiving, as though the season itself were holding its breath. Out beyond the little towns of Mountain View and Sunnyvale and Cupertino, the orchards stand in long, patient rows. Apricot trees, plum trees, cherry trees, almond trees. Some are already showing the first pale froth of blossom, soft as cotton against the dark wood of their branches. The bees have gone to bed. A mockingbird sings, somewhere far off, then falls quiet. This is not yet Silicon Valley. There are no glass towers here, no parking lots full of expensive cars, no neon-lit campuses humming through the night. There is only the valley as it has been for 100 years. 40 miles of orchard country, stitched together by 2-lane roads and small wooden water tanks, and the distant whistle of the Southern Pacific train. They call this place, in 1955, the Valley of Heart's Delight. And on this evening, the name still fits. Down a quiet street in Mountain View, a small stucco bungalow waits with its porch light on. The lawn has been mowed that morning. A pickup truck sits in the driveway, the engine still warm. Inside the house, on the kitchen table, there is a casserole dish covered with a clean dish towel, and beside it, a small stack of neatly folded baby blankets, soft from many washings, smelling faintly of soap and sun. Paul Jobs is a machinist. He is 30-something years old, lean and weather-tanned, with the careful, deliberate hands of a man who has spent his life fixing things. Engines, lathes, automobiles, the small, hard problems of the working world. He grew up poor in Wisconsin. He served in the Coast Guard during the war. He believes, with a quiet stubbornness, that any object made by human hands can be taken apart, understood, and put back together better than it was. Clara Jobs is his wife. She is gentle, watchful, of Armenian descent, her dark hair pinned back, her eyes kind. She works as a bookkeeper. She speaks softly. She has wanted for a long time now to be a mother, and the wanting has been a quiet ache she has carried lightly, the way some people carry the memory of a song. Tonight that ache is finally easing. A car turns onto the street. Headlights sweep across the hedge. The car pulls into the driveway beside the pickup truck and stops. A door opens. A door closes. And then, across the small front lawn, up the 2 concrete steps, through the screen door of that modest bungalow, a tiny bundle is carried into the house. A boy, just days old, wrapped warmly against the February evening, sleeping the bottomless sleep of the very newly born. His birth mother, far away, is a young graduate student. She has made a hard and loving decision. She has asked only one thing of the people who would raise him, that they promise someday to send the boy to college. Paul and Clara have signed the paper. They have given their word. They do not yet know what to call him. In the days that come, they will choose the name Stephen Paul. Stephen, because they like the sound of it. Solid, plain-spoken, American. Paul, after his new father. But for tonight, he is just a sleeping baby in a bungalow in Mountain View, and Clara is sitting in the rocking chair by the window with him in her arms, and the orchards beyond the back fence are settling into their night-long silence, and the stars are coming out, one by one, over the long, dark line of the Santa Cruz Mountains. Paul stands in the doorway watching them, his wife, his son, and for a long moment he does not move, because he does not want to break the spell of it. In 60 years, this small valley will be the most famous place in the world for making things that think. But not yet. Not tonight. Tonight, there is only a porch light, and a sleeping child, and the soft, sweet almond blossom hush of a California evening in 1955, and a quiet promise made between strangers that this little boy, someday, would go to college. The years that followed were small years, in the best sense of that word. The Jobs family did not move into a mansion or a townhouse or even a neighborhood that anyone outside of California had yet heard of. They moved into a modest stucco bungalow in Mountain View, on a street where the sidewalks were warm under bare feet in summer, and where, if you stood on the porch at dusk, you could still smell the orchards. Because in 1955, the Santa Clara Valley was not yet Silicon Valley. It was the Valley of Heart's Delight. Mile upon mile of apricot trees and prune trees and cherry trees, all of them flowering each spring in a soft pink mist that drifted across the foothills like a held breath. In June, the air went sweet and heavy with ripening fruit. In July, the drying yards spread out beneath the sun, wooden trays as far as the eye could see, the apricots split and laid open like little golden coins, glowing. This was the world that Steve Jobs grew up in. A world of orchards and quiet streets, and the slow, patient work of things being made by hand. His father, Paul, was a machinist, a repossessor of cars, sometimes. A man who could take an old, tired automobile and bring it back to life in the driveway, panel by panel, bolt by bolt. He had been raised in the Midwest, served in the Coast Guard, and he carried with him a certain unfussy idea of what it meant to do a job properly. He did not have much. But what he had, he kept clean. What he built well. And early on, perhaps earlier than most fathers think to begin, Paul Jobs cleared a small section of his workbench for his son. Just a corner, just enough room for a pair of small hands. And he said, in essence, this is yours. This is where you'll learn. There is a story Steve would tell, again and again, for the rest of his life. A story about a fence. His father was building a fence around the back of the house, and he turned to his boy and he said, "You have to make the back of the fence, the side that nobody will ever see, the side that faces the neighbor's yard and the weeds. You have to make that side just as beautiful as the front. Because you'll know, even if no one else does. You'll know." A small lesson. A quiet lesson. Spoken in a backyard in Mountain View in the long, sloping light of a California afternoon, with the apricot trees murmuring just beyond the fence line. And yet somehow, that lesson would travel. It would travel into garages and circuit boards and the inside surfaces of computers that no customer would ever open. It would travel for 50 years. Inside the house, On the kitchen table, there were the Heathkits. If you have never held one, picture a cardboard box, heavy in the hand, full of tiny, gleaming pieces. Resistors and capacitors and lengths of bright copper wire, a folded instruction booklet, a little spool of solder. You could buy them by mail. A radio, an oscilloscope, a simple shortwave receiver. And by following the steps, carefully, a child could build, with his own two hands, a working machine. A young Steve would sit at that kitchen table for hours, the lamp pulled down low, a soldering iron warming in its stand, the smell of pine resin and solder smoke curling up toward the ceiling. And one by one, piece by piece, the parts in the box would become a thing that hummed, a thing that glowed, a thing that, when you turned the dial, brought voices from across the country into a quiet kitchen in Mountain View. It was, he would later say, the great gift of his childhood, because it taught him something profound. It taught him that the world around us, the radios, the televisions, the engines, the appliances, none of it was magic. None of it had fallen from the sky. All of it had been made by people. People not so different from him. People with patient hands, and a kitchen table, and a little spool of solder. And if they could make it, well then, perhaps, someday, so could he. Outside, the apricots ripened. The orchards stretched on, mile after warm and golden mile, the last of their long, slow centuries. But inside, at a small kitchen table, a small boy was learning the shape of the future. One careful piece at a time. The years moved as years do in that valley, softly in the rustle of leaves, in the slow ripening of fruit, in the long golden afternoons that seemed always to end with the smell of wood smoke and someone calling a child home for supper. By the late 1960s, the boy at the kitchen table had grown taller, leaner, sharper in the eye. He was a teenager now, with dark hair that fell into his face when he leaned over a circuit, and a way of looking at things, really looking, that older people found a little unsettling and wonderful all at once. He went to Homestead High School in Cupertino, a low brick school set among the last of the apricot trees, where the bells rang softly through warm classroom windows and the parking lot shimmered in the heat. Cupertino, in those evenings, was the gentlest kind of place. Ranch houses with wide eaves, lawns watered at dusk, the hush of sprinklers ticking across the grass, stations, wagons in the driveways, their chrome cooling in the shade, and above it all, the dry hills of the Santa Clara Valley turning the color of toast in the long western light. It was in one of those quiet suburban garages on one of those quiet suburban streets that the younger Steve was introduced to the older Steve. The older one was named Stephen Wozniak. Everyone called him Woz. He was tall, soft-spoken, almost shy, the kind of teenager who carried slide rules in his back pocket and read electronics manuals the way other boys read sports pages. He was a few years out ahead of Jobs, already a quiet legend among the engineering kids, the boy who could draw a working computer on a napkin from memory. A mutual friend brought them together in a garage one warm afternoon, the kind of garage that smelled of motor oil and cut grass and old cardboard, where a single bare bulb hung from a beam and a portable record player sat dusty in the corner. There were transistors and coffee cans, a soldering iron, still warm, a schematic pinned to the wall with a thumbtack. The two of them looked at each other across the workbench, the lanky engineer and the intense, curious dropout-to-be, and something quiet recognized something quiet. They began to talk about chips, about op-amps, about the latest issue of Thomas Popular Electronics, about the strange, beautiful logic of solid-state things. And neither of them, in the soft Cupertino dusk, could quite stop talking. A friendship began that evening, easy, unhurried, the way the best ones do. They were unlikely twins. Woz was the gentler soul, the patient builder, happiest with a circuit on his lap and a cup of cocoa beside him. Jobs was the dreamer, the talker, the one who could see what a thing might become before it was even built. Together they made a kind of whole. They spent that summer, and the summers after, in each other's company. They biked through the orchards at dusk. They sat on porch steps, drinking warm Cokes from the bottle. They went to the public library and pulled down dog-eared books on logic gates. And mostly, they listened to Bob Dylan, long bootleg reels of him, hissing and crackling through cheap speakers, the poet of Hibbing singing of highways and harmonicas, while the boys lay on garage floors staring up at the rafters, dreaming. They built things too. Small, mischievous things. A little box, no larger than a paperback, that whistled certain tones into a telephone receiver, and quite remarkably, quite illegally, could place a free long-distance call to anywhere in the world. They called it a blue box. They sold a few, quietly, to college students. They laughed about it for years afterward. But beneath the pranks and the records and the lazy summer evenings, something larger was settling around them. They could feel it the way you can feel weather coming. The valley was changing. New companies with strange short names, Intel, AMD, National Semiconductor, were rising from the orchards, their low buildings spreading like patient mushrooms among the fruit trees. The chips inside their little gadgets were growing smaller, smarter, cheaper, almost month by month. Something was being built here. Something that did not yet have a name. And the two Steves, sitting on a curb in Cupertino at the end of a warm summer day, watching the porch lights come on one by one down the long, quiet street, did not know yet that they would build it. They only knew that the evening was soft, that the records were good, that a friend was beside them, and that the future, somewhere just past the orchards, was beginning to hum. The hum carried north. Past the apricot orchards and the long brown hills, past the coastal fog that gathers each evening over the redwoods, the road climbs slowly into Oregon. And there, in the autumn of 1972, on a campus of wooden halls and tall, dark fir trees, a 17-year-old boy stepped down from a long bus ride with a small bag and a thin jacket and looked up into the rain. Reed College sat on the eastern edge of Portland, tucked among mossy paths and old brick chimneys, its lawns soft with the smell of wet pine. The buildings were low and quiet. Lamps burned yellow in the library windows even in the afternoon, because the sky in that part of the world was the color of pressed tin from October to April, and the rain came down not in storms but in long, gentle conversations. Steve walked the paths in sandals. He found his dormitory, set down his books, and breathed in the cold, green air. He had wanted this. For months he had told his parents, Paul and Clara, in their small house in Los Altos, that this was the only college he would attend. Not Stanford, just down the road. Not Berkeley, with its wide gates. Reed, far away, expensive, strange. And Paul and Clara, who had not gone to college themselves, who had saved for this in the patient way that working people save, had said yes. They had driven him to the airport. They had let him go. But the tuition was heavy. The classes, for all their beauty, did not always speak to him. And after a single semester, one autumn of falling leaves, one set of winter exams, one Christmas spent watching the rain run down the dormitory glass, Steve made a quiet decision. He went to the dean. He told him, in the calm voice of someone who has thought a long time, that he could not in good conscience spend his parents' savings on a path he was not sure of. He dropped out. But he did not leave. This is the strange and lovely heart of the story. He did not pack his bag and ride south. He stayed on at Reed, unenrolled, unofficial, a ghost among the students. He slept on the floors of friends' rooms, rolling up in a blanket each night and rolling it again at dawn. He returned empty Coca-Cola bottles to the corner store for the deposit, 5 cents apiece, and walked the 7 miles across the city on Sunday evenings to the Hare Krishna temple, where, no questions asked, anyone who came was given a hot meal of rice and lentils and warm bread. He was hungry, often. He was cold, often. And he was, by every account of those who knew him then, deeply and quietly happy. Because now, freed from the program, he could choose. He sat in on the classes that called to him. Greek philosophy, Eastern religion, modern dance, long, drifting conversations in the dim lounges about consciousness and electronics and music and the shape of a good life. And one afternoon, walking past a poster on a corkboard, he stopped. Reed, in those years, was famous for a small thing. Every poster on campus, every flyer for a lecture or a play, every label on a drawer in the library was hand-lettered with extraordinary care. The man behind this was a calligraphy teacher named Robert Palladino, a former Trappist monk, soft-spoken, patient, who had given his quiet life to the shapes of letters. His class was tiny. It was offered for love, not for credit. It taught the old hands, serif and sans serif, the spacing between letters, the rhythm of a line on a page, the difference between a typeface that breathes and one that does not. Steve, who needed nothing from this class, who would receive no grade and no record, signed up. And for one slow term he sat at a long wooden desk with a steel nib and a little pot of ink, learning to draw an A. Learning the patience of an O. Learning that the space between two letters could be as alive as the letters themselves. Outside the windows the rain whispered down. He could not have known then what this small, useless class was planting. He only knew that the rain was kind, that the ink smelled good, and that something, somewhere inside him, was learning to listen. That listening, it turned out, was only the beginning. By the spring of 1974, Steve was 19 years old. no longer enrolled in any college, working odd shifts at a small video game company in Los Gatos to save up his pennies. He had a friend from Reed named Daniel, a gentle, searching young man who had already been to India once and come back with stories that sounded, to Steve, like the answer to a question he had not yet learned how to ask. They pooled their savings, a few $100s between them. Enough, in those quiet years, for 2 one-way tickets and a hope. And so, on a soft morning that smelled faintly of jet fuel and orange blossom, Steve Jobs flew east. He landed in northern India in the warm, dusk gold light of the late dry season. The air was thicker than any air he had ever breathed. It carried marigold and wood smoke and the slow, far-off ringing of temple bells. He stepped down onto a tarmac that shimmered with heat, and for a long moment he simply stood there, blinking, letting the new world settle on his shoulders like a shawl. He had come, he believed, to find a teacher, a great wise man who would look into him and name the thing he was carrying. But the teacher he had hoped to meet had passed away only months before his arrival, and so Steve, thin and hopeful, set out on foot instead. With a bedroll on his back and a pair of sandals he soon left behind altogether. Barefoot then, along country lanes the color of cinnamon, past low stone walls and slow-walking cattle with garlands around their horns, past women in saffron and rose, balancing brass pots on their heads as if gravity were merely a suggestion. The dust rose up to meet his soles and warmed them, and the soles of his feet grew thicker, kinder, more honest by the day. At night, he slept in simple ashrams, quiet houses of prayer where strangers were given a mat, a bowl of rice, and the gift of being unbothered. He learned the small rituals of stillness, to sit, to breathe, to rise before the light. He let his hair grow tangled, and then, one slow afternoon, he sat on a low wooden stool and let it all be shaved away, every dark wave of it, until his head was bare as a river stone, cool to the touch, and the wind could speak to him directly. Then came the monsoon. The rains arrived not as weather, but as a presence, a long gray breathing across the whole subcontinent, and the dirt roads turned to slow rivers of clay. Steve walked anyway. His clothes stayed wet for weeks. The soles of his feet softened, then hardened again. And somewhere in those drenched, slow-moving days, he caught a fever that would not let him go. Dysentery, the doctors would later say. And he lay for many quiet nights on a thin mat in a village room, watching a single oil lamp tremble against the rafters, dreaming the strange, bright dreams of a body emptied out. He grew very thin. He grew very still. And in that stillness, something he had been carrying around quietly began, at last, to set itself down. He understood, lying there, that the great teacher he had crossed the world to find was not going to walk through the doorway. That perhaps no one was. That the answers he wanted were not waiting at the end of any road, however long. They were simply the road itself, the bare feet, the borrowed bowl, the breath drawn in, the breath let out. He began to see how much of the noise in his life had been unnecessary, how many things he owned and did not need, how many words he had spoken that need never have been spoken at all. He thought of his father in the Mountain View garage, working a single piece of wood until it was right. He thought of the calligrapher's brush, the single confident stroke. Less, he understood, was not a smaller version of more. less was its own quiet country. When the monsoon finally lifted, he made his slow way home. He arrived back in California in the autumn, 7 months after leaving, and his mother almost did not recognize the young man who stepped off the plane. His head was shaved. His frame was thinner. His eyes had a softness in them they had not had before, a settled, patient softness, as if some inner room had been swept clean and left open to the air. He had not found a teacher. He had found instead a way of seeing, and he had brought it home with him, barefoot, in the warm October light of the Santa Clara Valley. The spring of 1976 came softly to Los Altos. The orchards along the foothills were still there in those days, their pale blossoms drifting like quiet snow across the lawns and driveways of the little stucco bungalows. Cars moved slowly down the side streets. Children rode bicycles in long, lazy circles. And on a tree-lined road called Crist Drive, at a house numbered 2066, a single-story home with a low roof and a wide front lawn sat warming itself in the afternoon sun. This was the house Paul and Clara Jobs had bought when Steve was a boy. A modest place, with a kitchen that smelled of coffee and toast, a living room where the television hummed softly in the evenings, and, attached to the side of the house, a small wood-paneled garage that Paul had filled over the years with the patient tools of a working man, a vise, a soldering iron, jars of screws sorted by size, and the calm clutter of someone who believed that anything could be fixed if you sat with it long enough. It was into this garage, on a bright afternoon in the spring of his 21st year, that Steve carried a folding card table. He set it down beneath the bare bulb in the ceiling. He brushed the dust from its surface with the edge of his hand. Then he stood for a moment in the open doorway and looked out at the driveway and the small slope of lawn, and the apricot blossoms drifting through the warm California air, and he smiled, very gently, the way a person smiles when they know that something is about to begin. His old friend arrived not long after. Stephen Wozniak, Woz as everyone called him, was a few years older than Steve, gentler in his manner, with a quick laugh and a mind so naturally suited to circuitry that wires seemed to obey him out of friendship. The two had met as teenagers, drawn together by a shared delight in electronics, and now, on this bright afternoon, Woz unloaded from his car a stack of green circuit boards, a tangle of wire, a coffee can full of resistors and capacitors, and a hand-drawn schematic that he had been carrying around, folded in his shirt pocket. They cleared a space on the card table. They plugged in the soldering iron, and then, with the unhurried care of two friends doing something they loved, they began to build. The garage filled, slowly with the small particular sounds of the work. The hiss of solder meeting the tip of the iron, the faint, sweet smell of resin smoke, the click of a component dropped into a tray, the soft, low conversation of two young men hunched over a board beneath a single yellow bulb while the spring afternoon turned gold outside the open door and the breeze carried in the scent of the apricot trees from the orchard at the end of the block. They worked through the cool of the evenings when the light went lavender over the rooftops. They worked through the warm summer nights when moths circled the bulb and the cicadas hummed in the garden. Sometimes Steve's mother, Clara, would bring out a plate of sandwiches and a pitcher of iced tea and set it down on a wooden stool and stand for a moment in the doorway watching them, the way mothers do, before slipping quietly back into the house. 50 boards, they had decided. 50 hand-built machines. They had no factory. They had no investors. They had only a card table, a soldering iron, a friend, and a garage that smelled faintly of motor oil and apricot blossom. And as the boards came to life one by one beneath their hands, small green rectangles bristling with components, each one a quiet little brain waiting to be woken, they began to speak, almost shyly, of what to call them. The name came easily in the end. There had been an apple farm in Oregon, where Steve had spent a season among the trees. There was the simple, clean sound of the word, friendly, familiar, easy to remember. And there was something about an apple, about its plain, round, everyday goodness, that felt right for a machine they wanted ordinary people to bring into their ordinary homes. The Apple One, they called it. And so, in a wood-paneled garage on Crist Drive, while the orchards bloomed and the evenings deepened and the soldering iron cooled and warmed and cooled again, two young men quietly built the first 50 members of a family that would, in time, come to live in nearly every house in the country. But that was still far away. For now, there was only the garage, and the warm light, and the work. The garage stayed a garage for a little while longer. Through the rest of that summer of 1976 and into the autumn, and through the cool, clear winter that followed, the two Steves and a small handful of friends carried on at the workbench under the bare bulb. Boards were soldered. Boards were tested. Boards were carried in cardboard boxes still smelling faintly of warm plastic down Crist Drive to a small computer store called the Bite Shop, where a kind man named Paul Terrell had agreed, on a handshake, to take 50 of them. The Apple One, bare and beautiful as a pressed leaf, found its first homes on the workbenches of hobbyists who already knew what a capacitor was, and who did not mind supplying their own keyboard, their own power, their own television set, their own patience. But Steve Wozniak, quietly, in his methodical engineer's way, was already dreaming further. He was sketching, on lined paper, at his kitchen table, a machine that would not ask so much of the people who bought it. A machine that would arrive in one tidy beige box. A machine that, when you plugged it in, would simply, gently, and almost magically turn on. And so in the spring of 1977, in a low-ceilinged hall at the West Coast Computer Fair in San Francisco, beneath fluorescent lights and the soft murmur of curious crowds, the Apple II made its quiet debut. It wore a smooth, cream-colored plastic shell that the young Steve Jobs had personally walked from plastic shop to find. Its keyboard was built right in. Its screen could show color. And when you switched it on, after a single warm chirp, it greeted you with a polite, blinking square of light, ready to listen. Within 2 years, that small beige machine had begun, very slowly and very surely, to walk out of the hobbyist's workshop and into the ordinary American home. Picture it now. A split-level house on a quiet street in suburban Ohio on a Saturday afternoon in 1979. The leaves are beginning to turn outside the den window. A father has cleared a corner of the desk where the family ledger usually lives. He has run an extension cord across the carpet. He has sat down, with both hands in the gentleness of someone placing an infant in a crib, a beige machine no bigger than a bread box, Beside it, on a wheeled metal cart, glows a small monitor the color of a harvest moon, a soft, warm orange that throws gentle light across the wood paneling and across the freckled face of his 9-year-old daughter, who is leaning in with her chin in her hands. She types her first line of BASIC. 10 space print space quotation mark hello quotation mark. She presses return. The cursor drops to the next line, patient as a cat. She types run. And the screen, in its small amber voice, says hello. And then hello again. And then hello, over and over, all the way down the screen, until she laughs, and her father laughs, and her little brother climbs up onto the swivel chair to see. In Oregon, on the same afternoon, a mother who teaches 3rd grade is figuring out how to make a turtle move across the screen in a language called Logo, so that on Monday morning, she can show her students how to draw a square with words. In a farmhouse outside Des Moines, an older brother is teaching a younger brother how to load a game called Lemonade Stand from a floppy disk that flutters and hums like a small, well-mannered bird. In a duplex in Tucson, a grandfather who once repaired radios for the Army is sitting very straight in his chair, peering through his reading glasses at a spreadsheet program called VisiCalc, and quietly understanding, for the first time, that the small numbers in the small boxes will rearrange themselves, all on their own, the moment he changes any one of them. He sits back. He says, softly, to no one in particular, well, I'll be. All across the country, in the warm orange glow of those small screens, on quiet weekend afternoons when the dishes were done and the football game was turned low, ordinary families were sitting together, shoulder to shoulder, parent and child, sibling and sibling, and meeting, for the very first time, a patient little machine that did exactly and only what they asked it to do. The orchards of the Santa Clara Valley were a long way away, but something that had begun there in a wood-paneled garage on Crist Drive was now humming very gently in living rooms from sea to shining sea. And the evenings in those rooms felt suddenly, quietly, full of possibility. And then, on a cool January morning in 1984, in a small auditorium at the Flint Center in Cupertino, a young man in a double-breasted suit stepped out from behind a curtain, slipped a floppy disk into a small beige machine, and let the room hear, for the first time, a computer say hello. The Macintosh smiled out from its little screen with a face made of pixels. It spoke in a thin, friendly, synthesized voice, and the audience, packed into the rows like schoolchildren on the last day of term, rose to its feet and cheered until the cheering itself seemed to become a kind of weather inside the hall. Steve was 28 years old. His hair was dark and tousled. His eyes shone. Behind him, a banner showed an apple with a single soft bite taken out of it, and somewhere in the wings, an engineer who had not slept in 3 days quietly began to weep. It was the brightest morning of his young life. But mornings, even bright ones, give way. Within a year and a half, the seasons inside the company had changed. The Macintosh, beautiful as it was selling more slowly than the spreadsheets had hoped. There were arguments in glass-walled conference rooms, and arguments in parking lots under the eucalyptus trees, and one long, quiet board meeting in the spring of 1985, in which, gently and firmly, the men around the table decided that the founder should step away from the things he had founded. He was 30 years old. He drove home in the late afternoon along Highway 280 with the golden hills of the peninsula rolling past his window, and for a long while afterward he sat on the floor of his big, almost empty house in Woodside and did not quite know what to do. This was the beginning of what he would later call the wilderness years. But the wilderness, you see, is not always a desert. Sometimes the wilderness is simply a quieter country, with longer evenings and slower rivers, and time enough at last to think. He started a new company. He called it NeXT, with a small letter E, tucked thoughtfully between the capitals, and he housed it in a low building in Redwood City, with long brick hallways and a floating staircase designed by a famous architect, and a perfectly black magnesium cube of a computer that hummed on the desks of a few patient researchers at a few patient universities. NeXT did not sell many machines, but in one of its quiet labs in faraway Geneva, a young Englishman named Tim Berners-Lee would soon sit down at one of those black cubes and write the very first pages of something he was calling the World Wide Web. Steve never quite knew in those years that this was happening on his little machine. The wilderness keeps its own secrets. And then there was the small studio across the bay. It sat in an old cannery building in Point Richmond, by the shore of San Francisco Bay, where the gulls turned in slow circles over the water, and the fog came in each evening like a soft gray blanket pulled gently over the rooftops. The studio was called Pixar, and Steve had bought it almost on a whim from the filmmaker George Lucas for $10 million. It was meant, at first, to sell expensive imaging computers to hospitals and oil companies. It did not sell very many. But upstairs, in a long, sunlit room full of drawing tables and coffee mugs and crumpled storyboards, a small band of animators were quietly teaching their machines how to dream. They made a short film about a desk lamp hopping after a ball. They made a short film about a tin toy at a baby's birthday party. And then, one evening, gathered around a flickering monitor, they began to sketch the shape of a cowboy doll named Woody and a space ranger named Buzz, and although none of them knew it yet, the seed of a story called Toy Story had just been planted into the soft soil of an old California cannery. Steve flew up the bay each week in those days, in his little plane, watching the salt marshes pass beneath him. At NeXT, the cube was beautiful. At Pixar, the animators were patient. Nothing was finished. Nothing was famous. But the work, quiet as it was good. And in the evenings, driving home along the dark sweep of the bay, with the lights of the distant cities trembling on the water, he was, perhaps, becoming the man who could one day go gently home. The call, when it came softly. It came in the late winter of 1997, in that gray in-between season, when the orchards that once covered Santa Clara had long since given way to low office parks and quiet cul-de-sacs, and when Apple Computer, the company born in his parents' garage 21 years before, was running out of money and perhaps more quietly out of ideas. The board, in its careful way, reached out to the man it had asked to leave a dozen years earlier. They did not ask for a savior. They asked, gently, if he might come and have a look. And he came home. He came back as a kind of advisor at first, without the title, without the salary. A single $1 a year, it would later be said. And he walked the long, fluorescent corridors of the Cupertino campus, the way a man walks back through the rooms of a house he once lived in, touching the door frames, remembering. There were too many products, There were too many committees. There were beige boxes stacked on beige shelves, and engineers who had stopped quite knowing what the company was for. He listened. He asked small, patient questions. And, very quietly, he began to clear the table. Most of the products were set aside. Whole projects, whole divisions, whole long, well-meaning years of work folded up and put away, as one folds an old map that no longer matches the country. What remained was a small, simple grid drawn on a whiteboard, a computer for the home, a computer for the office, a portable for each. 4 boxes. That was all. The rest could go. And from that quiet grid, in the spring of the following year, came a small, round, translucent thing, the color of sea glass. They called it the iMac. It sat on the kitchen tables of America like something half imagined. Its back curved like a smooth, polished stone. Its insides faintly visible through the soft Bondi blue of its shell, as though a computer had been crossed with a child's marble. There was no floppy drive, which puzzled the columnists. There was a handle on the top, which delighted the children. You took it out of its box, you plugged in 2 cords, and in a moment the screen warmed to life with a single, friendly word. It was, in its quiet way, the first deep breath the company had taken in years. And in those early Cupertino seasons, the late 90s, slipping softly into the new century, one good idea at a time was enough. A new kind of laptop, white and curved, like a river stone. A small, calm operating system built on the patient bones of the work he had done at NeXT in his wilderness years, brought home now and given a softer face. A retail store, the first of its kind, with pale wood floors and tables you could touch the machines on, the way you might touch fruit at a market. And then, on a cool autumn afternoon in 2001, in a small auditorium on the Apple campus, he stood in jeans and a black mock turtleneck and held up, between 2 fingers, a thing the size of a deck of playing cards. White, cool to the touch, a wheel on its face, like the dial of an old radio. 1,000 songs, he said quietly, in your pocket. They called it the iPod. It was such a small thing. Asterix people walked the dog with it. People mowed the lawn with it. People rode long, late buses home from work with it, watching the city slide by, their whole record collections riding home in their coat pockets. The company that had been a few months from closing its doors began, very gently, to find its footing again. There were no parades. The orchards did not come back. The garage on Crist Drive stayed quietly where it had always been, behind the bungalow, behind the lemon tree. But in the long, low-lit offices of Cupertino, and in the homes of millions of Americans, where a small, translucent computer now hummed on the kitchen counter, an old maker company was, one good idea at a time, coming softly back to life. And he, walking home in the early evenings beneath the soft California stars, was perhaps already thinking of glass. And glass, in the end, was where the long story was quietly heading. All through the autumn of 2006, in the low-lit design studios of Cupertino, small groups of patient men and women bent over wooden tables, turning a little rectangle in their hands. They sanded its corners. They softened its edges. They held it up to the light the way a jeweler holds a stone, looking for the place where the eye would rest. It had no buttons to speak of. It had only a single sheet of cool, clear glass, and beneath the glass, a quiet, waiting world. Steve walked among them in the evenings, in his soft gray sneakers, asking small questions. Could the icons be a little gentler? Could the corners be a little kinder? Could the whole thing feel, when you picked it up off a kitchen counter, like a smooth river stone you had carried home from a long walk? The engineers, tired and happy, made it so. And then, on the cold, clear morning of January the 9th, 2007, in a hushed auditorium in downtown San Francisco, the curtain went up. Outside, the winter fog was lifting off the bay. The cable cars were ringing softly up Powell Street. Inside the Moscone Center, the lights came down, and a single figure walked out onto the dark stage in a black turtleneck and a pair of faded blue jeans and a pair of round wire glasses, just as he had walked out, year after year, for 30 quiet years. He smiled. He let the room settle. He spoke in that soft, slow, almost shy way he had, the way a man speaks when he has been thinking about something for a very long time, and is at last ready to set it gently down. And then, after a long, easy pause, in the hush of that darkened hall, he held up a small, dark slab of glass and brushed aluminium, no larger than a deck of cards, and said the words the world had quietly been waiting for. There was a moment of perfect, breath-held silence. Then the room rose, slowly, softly, in a long, warm wave of applause that traveled out from the auditorium and across the bay and down the long peninsula, all the way home to the orchards of the Santa Clara Valley. And there, where our story has been all along, the evening light was beginning to settle over the low rooftops of Mountain View and Los Altos and Cupertino. The last of the apricot trees, the few that still stood between the new glass office parks, were turning gold along their tips. The hills above Stanford were softening into blue. Somewhere, a sprinkler was turning gently on a long suburban lawn. The garage on Crist Drive was still there. The bungalow was still there. The lemon tree was still leaning, just so, against the sun-warmed wall. A small gray cat was asleep on the driveway where, 31 winters before, two long-haired young men had carried a wooden workbench out into the half-light and quietly begun to solder. Inside the kitchen of that old house, the linoleum was still cool underfoot. The cabinets were still painted a soft cream. On the counter, where Clara Jobs had once set down a glass of cold milk for a small boy with serious dark eyes, the evening sun was laying down a long, slow rectangle of gold. And in living rooms all across America that night, in farmhouses in Iowa, in apartments in Brooklyn, in adobe bungalows in Santa Fe and white clapboard houses in Maine, ordinary people were turning small, glowing slabs of glass over in their hands and smiling and showing them softly to one another, the way people have always shown one another a beautiful, surprising, handmade thing. It had begun, as the best American stories so often do, in a garage, with a young man and an old friend, and a soldering iron, and a long, patient, hopeful summer afternoon. It had grown, as the best American stories so often grow, slowly and stubbornly, and not always sweetly, through long years of work and quiet and exile and return. And it had ended here on a cool blue California evening, with the orchards going gold and the lemon tree leaning against the wall, and the kitchen counter holding the soft last light of the day. Sleep now. The garage door is closed. The lemon tree is still. The long American story is, for tonight, gently, gently put away. Good night.